This is a continuation of lecture number 9. I want to tie up a few loose ends on the material that we were covering, dealing with the way in which the U.S. has established hegemony, and I also want to make a couple of comments on the way in which Stalin had dealt with his opposition in the 1930s that we didn't get to conclude with. And then we're going to move on to the Chinese Revolution and see exactly how that unfolded after the victory in 1949. First of all, you recall that when we were talking about the Congress of Victors, we stopped at a certain point before we had time to go into it in any detail. Now, I could spend time just reviewing all of the great industrial accomplishments that Stalin reviewed in his speech to the Congress of Victors, but that's in your book, and you could read that as you go along. This is in your book too, but the important factor for us to bring out in this lecture this morning is that when Stalin had been cracking the whip on making this 5-year plan work, for example, in the deportation of the kulaks, various things had happened that had angered his regional bosses. And one of those was that they no longer had access the way they'd had before to cheap labor from labor providers, which is a good time to bring up this business about the second economy in Russia, because for many years it's been traditional to look at the Soviet economy as it was in 1934 as a totally state-owned operation. But that is not completely correct. You always had a second economy running alongside the official economy. These were people who were providing a service which was considered to be important by party leaders, and so they didn't try to shut them down. One of those kinds of service providers had been people that would act in the same way that labor providers do in the U.S. They go to some spot in town where you know you've got 50 or 100 Mexicans lined up looking for a day's work, and you pick out the ones you want, you bring them back and put them to work. Well, once the collectivization got underway and the industrialization, all of those labor sources were gone. So the regional bosses didn't have them to fall back on, and what that means is they had a much bigger chance of falling behind in their production quotas. And production quotas during the 5-year plans were not something that you wanted to fall behind on if you were a regional boss. I mean, that would first of all get you in serious trouble with your headquarters higher up, and could even get you shot. So they were unhappy. These regional bosses were all unhappy with Stalin at the time of the Congress of Victors. So unhappy that they had gone to a man named Kirov, who was at this time the party boss for Leningrad, and asked him to run against Stalin to be general secretary. And now the problem with that was, for Kirov, the problem was that Stalin was probably his closest friend, and he agreed with Stalin on just about everything, although he had said many times that he thought Stalin got hysterical about the pace. And these managers, that's what they were mad about, was the pace, and they wanted to send Stalin a message. They figured Kirov was so popular in the party they could put him forward and he might win. Well, how did that vote turn out? First of all, Kirov went to see Stalin and he offered not to run against him. Stalin said, "No, go ahead and run." He said, "You'll come in number 2, but I'd rather have you sitting there ready to take my spot than some cream puff Bolshevik like Bukharin." He used tougher language than that, but because we might have young people watching this, I've decided to kind of back down on the way the Bolsheviks talked among each other commonly, with a lot of swearing and rough talk. At any rate, the final vote turned out there were 4 secretaries to be elected, first, second, third, and fourth. The first, Stalin, was elected with 1,056 votes as first secretary. But the second secretary came in, Kirov, at 1,055 votes. That's just one beneath him. Now, that meant Kirov had already been set up as the successor to Stalin should he retire or die or be replaced. And this is what Stalin had meant by having The only difference between Kirov and him was the difference in congeniality and personality, really. Otherwise, there wasn't much difference, but the bosses were ready to settle for that, figuring that once they had a sensible man in command, they might be able to go further and get some of the other concessions that they felt that they needed. Now, that vote had effectively placed Kirov in the number 2 spot. At the same Congress, the party ordered him to be transferred from Leningrad to Moscow. Now, Kirov didn't want this job. He didn't want this transfer to Moscow. He liked his Leningrad job there. He'd been in position there ever since Zinoviev had been removed, and he'd come to like it. Kirov was quite a ladies' man too, and apparently he had some romantic affairs going on up there. He didn't want to go to Moscow, make a long story short, so he delayed it as long as he could. And in December 1934, he was assassinated. A gunman stepped out from behind a column and shot him in the head, and he was dead. Now, it turns out that this gunman had been a former Chekist himself, but had trouble within his own organization, and he blamed a lot of this on on Kirov, and he was especially mad about Kirov having an affair with his wife. So these seem to be the reasons why this particularly relatively unstable fellow did what he did. Now, Stalin had gone up there to investigate this matter personally because Kirov was, of course, number 2 and his closest friend, and he had set into motion an investigation which would eventually turn up the former boss there, Zinoviev, and Kamenev as the 2 who were responsible for organizing the opposition in Leningrad to Kirov and therefore to Stalin and the party. And as we've seen, those 2 were shot in 1936 before the end of the summer. That's one thing I wanted to bring up. But you can also see here that Stalin knows that he knows perfectly well that he's been warned by his regional bosses that there's a limit to how much what they consider to be abuse that they're willing to take, and they've gone as far as to challenge his authority by putting Kirov in a position where he's only 1 vote short of being first secretary, which is the new title of the old general secretary. Anyway, so something has to be done about reforming the party internally, getting these regional bosses under control. Suffice it to say, for the moment, that was done, and the makeup of the next Congress is going to be quite different. Most of these people that voted against Stalin in the Congress of Victors will be gone by that time, one way or another. And Stalin will have consolidated his power over the Congress, which is the ultimate source of authority for the Central Committee and the Political Bureau and, of course, the First Secretary. The next thing I want to go to after that is what was happening in China. Now, in lecture number 7, we talked about the period in China from 1921 to 1927, and I had mentioned in there that Chiang Ching had joined the party. I said in the early 20s, that wasn't Spoonerism on my part, it was the late 20s when she joined, and she was active secretly by providing information to Red Army intelligence inside China, that is to Mao's intelligence, of what was actually, the Green Gang was actually planning there. Now, something happened. I don't know if her cover got blown or she just got tired of being there, but in the late 1930s, I believe 1938, she escaped from Shanghai, where she had been this actress, model, whatever, for the Green Gang, and made her way to the lush caves of Yan'an, which is, by this time, is where Mao Zedong had arrived and established his own little Red Republic. That little republic would become the base from which he would conquer all of China. Now, just to conclude her story for the moment, when she got up there, Mao Zedong took her as his new wife, which meant he had to move wife number 2, the first wife, remember, Chiang Kai-shek had killed in the 1927 roundup of communists. The second wife he had been with him during the entire Long March, and made it all the way up to Yan'an with him, and then had been at his side continuously until now, when Chang Ching shows up, and suddenly she's asked to leave the cave, and Chang Ching is brought in there. Now, this had a very bad effect on the rest of the party leadership. They called her a sing-song girl. Said that she had no, how could Mao give up this wonderful woman that had traveled with him throughout the Long March and been such a big help to him up there and setting up in Yunnan, for this prostitute, which is what they considered her to be, out of Shanghai. And this is about as close as Mao ever got to being thrown out as party leader, because they were that unhappy about it. When he finally refused to change his mind, they said, well, if you're really going to bring this woman in, it's going to have to be with all of these conditions. She can't be part of any of our leadership discussions. She can't be a public figure of any kind. She's going to have to confine her activities to schoolwork and cultural activities like making of movies or plays and things like that. And he accepted all of that, and so did she. Okay, but looking back on it, it's not too hard for me to understand what happened there. I mean, what would you do today if Tara Patrick showed up on your heterosexual doorstep and she says, I want to move in here for a few years, help you do what you're going to do? Well, you might do what he did. So that sounds like a good idea to me. Or you might not, but at any rate, that was the situation with regard to her. Now, how did he get into that position to begin with? Well, if I had a map here, what I would do is draw a line from Shanghai all the way through southern China. In other words, you remember how they got to Shanghai in the northern wing, and they had been radicalizing these peasants along the way till they got to Shanghai. Then they got massacred, and their government, Wuhan, was overthrown, and they were outlawed. But up here in the Kiangsu Hunan Mountains, Mao had built a little Red Republic, and he had withstood 4 anti-Red Bandit campaigns of the fascist Chiang Kai-shek and his Japanese and Nazi suppliers. Finally, they were building blockhouses closer and closer and encircling this Soviet Republic up in the mountains, and as the German advisors and the fascist forces of Chiang Kai-shek kept moving their army closer, 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 and this time they had whipped them 4 times before in this process, but this time the communists decided that they were not going to be able to withstand the 5th one the way they had the last one, and what they better do is get the hell out of there. So they made a secret plan to march all of their followers plus their army and across South China, up the eastern side of China, that is past Tibet, and then over to the Wangho River Valley in Yan'an. That's where they wanted to take a look at the map. You'll see where those Yan'an caves are. Loess is a kind of rock that is formed out of glacial sand and fine grains that have been blown into these loess deposits and then compacted into rock. But they're easy to, it's like you could carving a cave out of soap or soapstone and then moving in there and setting up your headquarters. So everybody had dug their homes and their different shops and so on into these loess cliffs. Now, they had taken 2 years, as I recall, to make this long journey of about 20,000 li, I think that's about 5,000 miles, across all of southern China, up the eastern side, and then over into Yan'an. When they got to Yan'an, they only had a few hundred people left out of the hundreds of thousands that had started. But that's for 2 reasons. First of all, they'd been fighting constantly every day of this movement, and they had lost, of course, a number of people there. Also, they left a number of people behind in each of these areas that they were marching through, which was one of the original reasons for the Long March, was to set up a base among these peasant farmers who'd already been with them once and who had been propagandized to for quite a while, and who are now being told that, you are going to be an important part of this civil war as it develops, but we're going to have to move on. So groups were left behind to help organize all of this. And they kept losing people through natural causes too, like the climb up through the Tibetan mountains there on the edge of Xinjiang, the climb or the walk through many miles of swampy country and so on took its toll on these fellows. They had to cross bridges under fire. In other words, they were losing a lot of men from daily combat, as well as from exposure to the elements. They didn't even have one doctor during this period of time, but not until Norman Bethune showed up from his adventures in Spain, and he showed up in Yan'an and became the only doctor that the Red Army had had up until that time. So, now, however, after 1945, Chiang Kai-shek was so busy stealing from the Americans, as we started mentioning last time, that he didn't have time to really pursue this war. What his interest in this whole thing had always been making money. That was the Green Gang's interest, and they were making more money off of stealing from these stupid Americans, which is how they looked at them, than they had ever made stealing from the Japs and from their own people. So they could not be distracted from their primary task of stealing. This was good because the Communist Party needed every break it could get to launch its Revolutionary Armed Forces into the rest of the country and retake China completely. Now, they had built up a big army. The Japanese had launched what they called their Five Alls campaign, which is burn all, kill all, loot all, whatever it was, and which they'd killed about 22 million Chinese civilians in the years prior to in the years after they started fighting with the Chinese Communists directly. And that was something that had fed huge numbers of volunteers into the Red Army, what became the People's Liberation Army, at the time was called the 8th Route Army, was all of a sudden swelling, and it was doubling in size and tripling and so on, because people that hadn't been slaughtered by these Japanese who would come in and just with the order just burn up, kill everybody in the village, those that had managed to run away or from neighboring villages who heard what was happening and run away, they had all gone up to join with the communists and join their Red Army. So they were getting bigger day by day. Finally, rewind this thing up, the Russians had protected the Chinese communists by threatening to intervene in Berlin when Truman was threatening on atomic bombing the columns that they were moving against Chiang Kai-shek. And so he'd had to hold off on that. So by September 1st, 1949, the Maoists were in Beijing and driving the Chiang Kai-shek forces out of the rest of the country, step by step. Now, so then he declared the People's Republic of China, and they began to go through a series of steps, which we want to review real quickly here at this time. So that's how they had gotten into Yan'an. That's why she was up there in 1938 to meet Mao. They had fought the Japanese all through World War II, when Chiang Kai-shek never would fight the Japanese. He had an alliance with them that went on forever. He talked the story, talked the talk, but he never walked the walk. So the only real fighting that was going on inside China was being done by the communists. Now the Americans had recognized this quite early, that Chiang was useless. So they had established a military relationship with the Chinese communists. General Stilwell was one of those reactionaries who had, in this particular case, decided that he wanted to support the communists in the war effort because they were the ones that were doing the fighting. There was another U.S. lieutenant colonel who went over there to help and came back to the U.S. with he was a Marine, and he came back with this slogan called, we'll come back to that in a minute, but at any rate, the important thing was that when the Americans had established direct and indirect military ties with the Chinese communists, and they wanted to save that relationship to the degree that they could in the 1945 to 49 period, But the problem was that they no longer had the support of the President of the United States. They now had to now they had the President changing policy with regard to China, and that means that their days of working with the Chinese Communists were about over. Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to go to a civil war standstill. He'd agreed to that with the Americans, but never did it. Just kept on doing what he was doing. And because in order to keep the money flowing from the Truman administration, he at least had to put on a show that they were doing something against the communists. Well, eventually all of that collapsed, and the communists simply whipped them again and again in the field, and the fascist forces of Chiang Kai-shek couldn't get out of there fast enough. They didn't put up any real resistance, and to make a long story short, they fled to Formosa, or to what's now Taiwan, and you can watch that movie Formosa Betrayed for the gruesome details of how Chiang established fascism there. Now the challenge for the communists that are victorious within China will really start, because China was extremely primitive back in 1914, 1920, in the years that after 1921, when the Bolsheviks had decided to form an alliance with Sun Yat-sen. They had done it partially because they didn't think China was anywhere near close enough for socialism. Well, these Chinese communists had been studying this history of theirs very closely, and the history of the Soviet Union, and they knew that their country wasn't really ready for socialism of the Soviet type in 1949 or 1950. So while the U.S. press went crazy talking about the Soviet designs to conquer the world as they had just shown in China, what in reality was happening is that the Chinese had to confront their technological backwardness and do something about it. Now, you have a period in the 1950s where China goes through several stages. The first of which was they had to have a land reform. So they formed a consultative Congress. They formed several alliances with bourgeois farmer parties, and they began in 1950 to collectivize agriculture. And so in agriculture, that was the first step. The next step would be to set up collective farms and cooperatives, and then the final step would be was when they created these people's communes, which was like a huge collective farm. Those are stages that they had to go through just to clear the deck for what had been happening with this feudal fascist history of theirs. It went back, the feudal history went back a couple thousand years. Their fascist history under Chiang Kai-shek had been going on for about 30 years. They had to clear the deck of all of that crap, and that's what they got down to doing right away. Now, that, however, was just part of the show, because simultaneously they had to industrialize. So that meant that in the cities, the communists were going to be starting largely from scratch, because any bases they had in the cities were secret, underground organizers. And now they had to figure out how they could get industrialization underway in China. Now that turns out to be, from 1950 to 1975, we have 25 years of struggling, trying to figure out how to get industrialization going, how to mobilize the working class to take command and build the kind of industry. And they couldn't do it the same way. They soon realized they couldn't do it the same way Stalin had in the Soviet Union. And you'll recall that what they'd done there when they got collectivization underway, that is reorganizing agriculture, they had also started using that money to buy industrial equipment, bringing it in, planning it, and then bringing in existing industrial workers while they were training new ones to run it. Well, China didn't have the labor force to run any of these kinds of factories, even if they had the money to get them, which they didn't. So until they had control of the agricultural produce on the land, and it was adequate to feed at home as well as to have material like wheat to export, they wouldn't have the indigenous resources. Mao Zedong had gone to Moscow right after the revolution, his first foreign trip, And there Stalin had taken him under his wing eventually and showed him the true nature of where the Soviet Union was at that moment. And it was not in a very good position. And as he told Mao, we don't have the money or the industrial plant to do all the things that you've asked us to do, but we'll do what we can. And we will ask you to do the same thing, and we'll do more as time goes on. Mao had agreed to all of this. Of course, he didn't really have much choice. So when he went back to Beijing, he went back without all of the things that he had hoped to come back with. For one thing, he didn't realize what bad shape Russia was in, and now he did. So, and he also knew that Stalin was not going to do anything more than what they had agreed to on paper so far, and that meant that his trip was a deep disappointment to many of the party leaders. But they buckled down and they got underway with regard to both industrialization and the land reform that was going on in the countryside. So pretty quickly after the seizure of the land and the redistribution, it went into collectivization and cooperatives. And soon after that, however, it wasn't producing enough either. Mao got the idea of building a giant collective farm called the People's Communes. And while all that was going on, the Russians began to flood as much support, technical support for Chinese industry as they could through the 1950s in there. So there was an increasingly large number of emigre Russians moving to China on a semi-permanent basis to help them establish industrial plants. And that went on. Now, we want to remember I said a few minutes ago that there was always a second economy in the Soviet Union. Even during the height of the Stalin years, when virtually every part of the major economy, that is the first economy, was under Bolshevik control, there were still all these guys who have small factories where they produce bricks, for example, or supply labor, or something that wasn't in the plan. They had been tolerated because they performed a function of providing things that weren't in the plan or weren't being provided by plan managers. Well, much the same thing had happened in China. Now, Mao had watched what happened in Russia. He'd watched what Khrushchev had done after he took over, and what he thought he saw was a revisionist counter-revolution against Marxism and Leninism. Now, he eventually began to attack the Soviet leadership outright, and we just mentioned that a little bit in the last lecture. But what he was confronting at home was a similar kind of thing that Stalin had confronted inside Russia, and that was that it's not just the second economy out there, which is throwing up private capitalists who would do away with it and say, oh, we have new technicians. By 1938-39, Stalin had over 10 million of these newly educated Bolshevik managers. He was a class, and he called it the classless intelligentsia. And the idea was that as long as you kept them under close police control, you wouldn't have to worry about the fact that they might well be developing a bourgeois sense of entitledness, that they might be beginning to lose their proletarian consciousness, in other words, assuming they already had it. This same thing was happening inside China, and it was happening, these developments were reflected inside the Chinese Party the same way similar developments have been reflected inside the Soviet Party that we just talked about. In 1934, at the Congress of Victors, Stalin won by one vote against Kirov. That was something that had to be approved behind the scene, of course, before those votes were released. But the fact that they would show Kirov as that close was not an accident. These are the regional bosses who had become disgruntled, and now Stalin was confronted with the wrath of his regional bosses. Well, the same thing was happening inside the Chinese Party. People were lining up. Of course, everybody's using this left-wing phraseology. The first one to go was Liu Shaoqi, China's president, an old-line Chinese communist who'd been in the party for forever, and he was forced out by the Maoists, who said he was taking the capitalist road, meaning a road similar to what Khrushchev was following inside the Soviet Union. And all of this was explained in detail. What we're getting up to here is the collapse of U.S. hegemony over the capitalist world, the collapse of revisionism, and the collapse of global capitalism. Let's take the collapse of revisionism first, and it's in 1990. So we're going to jump here from 1960 to 1990. In those 30 years, the Khrushchev gang goes through a couple more leaders, and eventually it becomes apparent that everything that the Chinese communist leaders had said, that is Mao Zedong and his group had said about the Russian party, is unfortunately coming true. It has turned into a government which has as its eventual objective the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Now, the particular way in which this is happening is that you have two things going on. This classless intelligentsia that Stalin had kept under control with the secret police has now been out of control for 30 years, and they have developed a position of their own politically within the Communist Party. The second is, outside the party, altogether, for the most part, are the guys in the second economy who are organized by local criminal syndicates in Georgia, the Ukraine, Belarus, and various places in Eastern Europe, but especially strong in Georgia and in that area of Russia that borders on Georgia. The betrayal of the socialism that is going to be triggered here had actually begun with Khrushchev, and but now it's going to be a new gang altogether that is going to take over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And I'm just going to give you an overview quickly of some of the things that we're going to be going on into in the next lecture in more detail. The first thing that happened was that the two men had to be removed after Brezhnev died of natural causes. These two guys were both assassinated in reality, but at the time it wasn't that obvious. Now we'll skip over those two because those were the last two hopes that the Soviet Party had of maintaining any kind of authentic socialist stance over the country. These are people who actually believed in what they'd been trying to do, but had gotten off on the wrong track by putting up with Khrushchev and his bunch, and now they were going to face the same kind of consequences that he had faced, and that was that there was another man named Gorbachev who was now in line to become head of the CPSU, and he did. And this was pretty much the end of the whole thing. This guy Gorbachev had been part of this organized crime syndicate out of southern Russia that also bordered on Georgia for a long time, but he'd been one of those kind of people that they had kept his mouth shut and had him jump through all of the hoops that party people were supposed to be jumping through before they could be appointed to such a high position. And he'd done a pretty good job of that. He had shown that he had a certain amount of sympathy for what was called liberal communism in Eastern Europe, but that wasn't unusual in the revisionist camp for people to talk like that, and he didn't talk too far. Now, the other thing is you had these mafiosos out there in Georgia and southern Russia who they had found loopholes in the law. So they could, for example, they had control of the housing market pretty much. They were, believe it or not, there was a law which allowed individuals to own their own homes if they built them themselves. So using that as an excuse, these private capitalists had set up regular house building companies, just like you'd have here in the States, and they would go to these private labor suppliers to get the labor that they needed, just the same way that a guy building houses out here might go to a temporary Mexican labor stop, pick up 10 workers, bring them back for the day, pay them in cash, and so on. This group was now making an alliance with the structural bourgeoisie, that is the classless intelligentsia, that had been arising within the party under Stalin and of course under Khrushchev. As those two got together, they intermarried, they began to form all kinds of political alliances. They eventually formed the social base which would overthrow the Communist Party of the Soviet Union altogether. Something that hardly anybody would have believed was possible when this process started out, but it not only was possible, it did happen. Okay, now that was 1990, when by the time that this revisionist thing collapsed altogether. In 2004, that is 14 years later, the United States lost its hegemony over the world capitalist class because of its failures in Iraq. And that was a direct consequence of this Wolfowitz-Kagan doctrine. I get a kick out of these two guys. When Kagan did an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times about 10 years ago, it was mostly about trying to claim that he was the one who had started this policy of confronting confronting the Soviet Union, China, and Iran, and establishing the U.S. as a world power. And he had just got done lecturing at Annapolis on small unit warfare, which is what he was advocating to replace the old massive U.S. Army style approach. And at any rate, so the doctrine that these two guys, Wolfowitz and Kagan, put together was pretty well defeated when the U.S. began to lose definitively its war in Iraq. Now, finally, in 2008, global capitalism collapsed and had to be saved by the intervention of the U.S. Central Bank and Treasury, where they all of a sudden fronted $1 trillion to cover all of these banks who had made bad bets, or at least bets that they couldn't cover, put it that way. And that was the beginning of this business of printing endless amounts of money and giving it to the bankers that is going on to this very day, which is 2014. So in the last 6 years, they haven't learned a damn thing about economics except how to steal more effectively, and that's something else. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the collapse of three things: the Soviet Union, that is revisionism; the collapse of U.S. hegemony in 2004 because of Iraq; the collapse of global capitalism in 2008. And leading up to that, you want to keep in mind that China is not part of this discussion right now because, first of all, in the Wolfowitz-Kagan doctrine, China has been set aside as somebody that can be dealt with next. What we have to deal with is the Soviet Union, or what Russia today, which can still produce, it does produce 4 new nuclear warheads every month, every week, and we have to, if we can't nullify that military force, then we can't really do that much about Iran and China either, nor would there be as much reason to. According to this Wolfowitz doctrine that they were working under, in order to dominate the world, they have to be able to block all these 3 major powers: Iran, Russia, and China. Of course, you can see, we know on a day-to-day basis what they're trying to do, and this last-ditch campaign of theirs in the Ukraine is coming apart. It's obvious that this regime in Kiev can't last more than a couple months, and a couple more months, no matter how many civilians they kill in the southeastern part of Ukraine. And China just blows off all of these U.S. objections to the way in which they have resisted the aerial assaults on their intelligence service. They don't amount to much anymore. So I'm sure the U.S. will keep causing trouble for China by running at their shores and trying to force them to turn on their radar and that sort of thing. But so what? What is it going to get out of them? They've never been in a worse position in Asia than they are now, and there's no reason to believe it'll ever get any better. So this Wolfowitz doctrine is coming apart at the very base of it, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But in the next lecture, I want to talk about the details of the restoration of capitalism and the overthrow of revisionism, or the collapse of revisionism in the Soviet Union. And that's probably one of the most important things you need to internalize, because people are naturally have been saying ever since 1990, well, communism failed in the Soviet Union and blah, 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 blah. Of course, these are people that don't have the slightest idea what they're talking about. They never did have any idea what they were talking about. They don't have any idea now. But the average person is aware that the communist government in Russia, so they're susceptible to any kind of argument that one of these clowns may bring up that seems to explain it. That's why it's important that you know the details of what happened there, and we're going to get into that in the next lecture.